So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of data and bias. Now, this is one of the topics that sounds incredibly boring, but hopefully as you get into this, you'll realize how interesting this area is. And it's one of my personal most interested areas of AI. So it's the problem around data and how important it is to AI. So data it's nice to describe it as the lifeblood of AI. You can't have today's level of generative AI without data. And one of the big reasons we're in the position we're in with AI is that we've got so much digitized data, everything's on the internet, and AI therefore has the ability to train on all that data, and that's where it gets all its knowledge. Now, that sounds amazing and it's produced some amazing results, but all of these results have a fundamental problem that, to my knowledge, has not yet been solved, and I don't know how it will be solved, but there's much cleverer people than me trying to do it. So it might be, but at the minute it's not. And that's the problem with bias and inaccuracy. So AI runs on all this data it's trained on. So a lot of the biggest AIs in the world, they've trained on every book that's ever been written. I believe. I think some of them might argue they haven't because of copyright, and there's also everything on the internet. So AI systems are not thinking like a human does. They are incredibly powerful pattern matchers. Now, I'm not saying that to downplay the level of complexity in what they're doing. It's more as a nice simplified way of thinking about them. So they are like amazing mathematical models of words and relations between words. So they match these patterns, and then they can produce things that follow similar lines. So they are trained on vast amounts of data, but this data includes and reflects on things, including things like human history. Now, as humans, we are moving away from the old world in a lot of ways. We are much better in certain ways than we used to be. But AI might be more of a reflection of the past than the present sometimes, with its bias, stereotypes, things like that. And we need to be aware of this and not continually to perpetuate those problems. So the key types of bias are, I've got them on the next slide, the bias in the data selection. So we know that the internet is flawed. We know the internet has got lots of problems, lots of inaccuracies. Now, if somebody were to go on the internet and basically delete everything, you can't do this, just bear with me as an example. If they were to delete everything they didn't want to make it into the training data, or just select the things they thought were correct, that is another type of bias. So the problem with doing something like that is you are creating a bias in that. So the AI will only know what it's trained on and what it learns from there. If we narrow down what it's trained on, in some ways that might improve, but that's still throwing in a type of bias. If we open it up to everything, we've got lots of other problems with that data. You could have a data imbalance, so that's where you feed it too much of one type of data. So an example of this would be, I was reading about a AI that was looking at scans of some part of the human body, I can't remember what it was, to detect cancer, and they was producing amazing results that I was reading about on the news. And it's great, but it was also, when you read deeper, it showed I can't remember if it was a gender or an ethnicity imbalance, because it was fed maybe more, say, female scans than it was male in the training data. So it was more accurate at picking up female cancer than it was male cancer, that type of thing. So that's just an example, and it's an amazing example of where healthcare potentially is going to go with the use of AI, improving healthcare and speed and accuracy and things like that. But it's also, we've got to be careful of this data imbalance. If we feed it the wrong amount of training data, we're going to have slightly imbalanced results one way or another. We've obviously got problems with the accuracy of the data, which is an example of this would be when Google Gemini first came out. I believe somebody was tweeting about how you could ask it about eating rocks and it came back with rock recipes and things like that. And the reason for that is, I believe somebody dug into it and found that there was a couple of dark humor websites that made some jokes about like rock recipes and things like that. It was meant to be funny, but as a human, you'd read that and you'd know it's just somebody being silly. But as AI, that website fed into the training data, and the imbalance and the accuracy problem was the website was obviously wrong, but there aren't lots of contradicting websites where they were saying you can't eat rocks because it's common knowledge. We don't write that down. So you could have problems with that, with the accuracy of data. So more common things, AI is very good at getting right because there's lots and lots of data of it in its correct form for it to have learned and made a strong mathematical relationship with the right answer. But the more nuanced and more specific things that you might ask AI, it's more likely to have an inaccurate answer. It doesn't mean it will be wrong. It's just it depends on the data in the training. And the last one is the historical bias, which I kind of mentioned briefly on the last slide. It's that idea of in the training data, you might have a lot of old historical information, old books that were written at a time where the world was very different, and that view of the world might therefore be perpetuated in the AI output, and we need to be aware and be careful of that. So going on from that, the best example I found to make this easy for everybody to understand is Bloomberg, and I don't want to take any credit for this because I had nothing to do with it. I just found it really interesting. It's Bloomberg, which I believe is a company in America. They looked at over 5,000 images generated of people when the AI image generators first started coming out. So the image generators are much better now, but it doesn't mean the bias isn't shown anymore. And this is a great way of you seeing the bias, because when you look at text, the bias is there, but it's harder to spot. So I think this visual representation is nicer. So what they did is they got the AI to generate, like say, 5,000 images of people, and all they did is give it a prompt like it shows you on the slide there, a color photograph of a judge. They didn't specify gender or anything like that, or ethnicity, and they just analyzed the results that came in. So hopefully, just looking at these examples here, you can see the problem. So by just asking for a photo of a judge, you're pretty much going to get a white male. And then if we look at some other examples, a photograph of a teacher, you can see it's very heavily female dominated. A photograph of a doctor, you can see similar problems. And then they took all of these images and they analyzed their skin tone and gender, and they put these little charts together, which I thought was really, really nice to see. Nice to see in terms of visually understanding the output, not the results are nice to see. And you can see here that higher paying occupations and lower paying occupations, you can see there's a significant problem here in the way AI is viewing the world based on the training data. And then you can see the same thing for gender. Look, again, we've got a big problem. Now, I'm not saying the world we live in today is perfect, and this isn't a problem we've still got, and we're trying to work through it. But is the problem as bad as what we're visually seeing on the screen now? Or I don't know the answer to this, by the way, but is the problem as bad as what we're seeing on the screen, or is this part of history and the historical data that's in the training model that's also feeding and impacting on this output? Because we've got to be really careful of this, that we don't rely on and heavily use AI outputted materials and continually perpetuate a world that we're trying to move forward from. We don't want to take a step back as humans to go back to by perpetuating these biases and stereotypes and things. An example would be, let's say in a few years, and I don't want to sound too crazy here, but let's say in a few years AI has the ability to generate TV shows. Okay, that might sound mad, but it's not really far away from where some of the technology is right now. So let's say it can generate TV shows. If it's based on the training data, we could have a situation where it would generate TV shows where every judge is a white male. And then what's that going to do if that's what's seen as in these generated images and videos? What's that going to do to people trying to think about becoming a judge in the future? And this is where we've got to be careful, and we've got to make sure anybody using AI, teachers, students, has a understanding of the problems with AI output, or the potential problems, so they can critique it properly. The next slide is just showing the average face of people in these different professions. Then why this matters now, why this matters in schools is because we've got a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to make sure we're teaching students right, so they understand the world right. That, they're growing up, they need to understand the basics of how AI works and why it can be wrong, especially if we are potentially putting them in front of AI that has this bias that we don't want. We need to make them know that that's not okay, and to critique it and understand why it is like that. It's not choosing to be, it's just we've got a flawed data set that it's trained on. We need to make sure we're not reinforcing stereotypes. We don't want to keep producing things that contain this type of bias and narrow perspective of the world. We also need to be aware that it can go wrong. I mentioned the rock thing earlier, the Google Gemini. It can go wrong and it can have errors, and it can sound very convincing in something that isn't right. And it's generally when you're in those more niche areas where you're asking your questions that are very specific, it's more likely to go off piste and be wrong. And we obviously need to make sure we've not got a lack of representation in things when we're producing worksheets or however we're using these AI systems in our schools. So as my sort of final slide here, I think we need to combat the bias with critical thinking. We need to always question the source. So we need to teach students and remind them that AI is not an author, but it's a pattern matching machine, and we need to check the output and verify it before we use it or rely on it. You can use more specific prompts, which will reduce the chances of the bias coming out. But I think it's inevitable these things are going to happen. And I think if it happens in a class, you can use it as a teachable moment. Why is this? What perspective is missing here? Why has this happened? What do you think might have been in the training data to lead to this? And we just need to obviously reinforce the value of human experience and social, emotional understanding, the things that AI can't do. That's where we need to focus our efforts. So that's the end of this short training video. Again, totally different topic to the others, but I think we've got quite a few of these left to do, so we'll keep doing them and hopefully finding them interesting. Thank you.